to our YouTube channel, and then also visit our website, and Tareq will be able to describe more about that and how you can connect with us, and also be able to read our updates coming from the courthouse, and also our sort of takes and our footage that we get throughout the day. I'm going to hand it over to you, Tareq, because you were able to actually get into the courtroom today. So if you could talk a little bit about some of the things that we have learned, and maybe how you feel about today's court proceeding.
Thank you. Yeah, so today we had the opening statements from the prosecution and defense. So the prosecution were laying out their case, basically going through the indictments, so the 18 indictments that have been brought upon Julian Assange. I don't think there was kind of a great deal of new information there, but I think what was telling was how weak the prosecution's case was today, and we can go into that in more detail. We have some lovely guests that were there in the courtroom today, and then we had the defense, which kind of there was. The main thrust of their argument was that there was significant abuse of power leading up to the charges, and several other kind of, infractions of what would be expected from a kind of normal court procedure. So, let's maybe hand it over to introduce our guests as well.
So we are joined by some very special guests, journalists and activists. We have Patrick Henningsen joining us, Deepa driver, and Mohammed Maazi. Now I know Mohammed and Patrick, you guys were able to get into the courtroom. So Patrick, I'll start with you. What was your perception of how today's court hearing went?
I was surprised that the prosecution obviously gave their sort of big push to I guess say that they wanted to dismantle the defense's main arguments. So they said that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether the evidence is real or not. It doesn't matter how you're interpreting what's going on around this. All that matters is what's in the extradition request. And so, prima facie, that's it. And so you can't argue that, I don't know how to explain this, but Mohammed would probably do a better job. But we're just flooded with information today, so
Mohammed, I know you
it's hard
do
to
have
unpack it, but
I know you do have a legal background, so maybe you could speak to the U.S.-UK treaty. I know that the defense was, or they want to argue that this extradition is political in nature, which is prohibited by the U.S.-UK treaty. Can you speak in a greater depth about that?
Well, just to finalize Patrick's point, that the prosecution was saying to the court today, it's James Lewis QC acting on behalf of the U.S. government, that this is an extradition proceedings, this is an extradition hearing, it's not a trial. The trial would be in the United States. And I think the point that Patrick is making is that the prosecution doesn't have to prove its case. There isn't the same sort of burden of proof as there would be at a trial. It merely has to satisfy the necessary box-ticking procedure which exists in the treaty. There is, and then to answer your question, there is a presumption in favor of extradition in terms of how the treaty is designed. The Anglo-American treaty, that is. Because it's a bilateral treaty, so it's not like it's a treaty that's signed with 50 different countries. And this particular treaty, typically, if the United States says this person is wanted for an offense in the United States, the presumption is in favor of extradition. It's then up for the defense to argue why one of the exceptions under the law applies and why this person shouldn't be extradited. So in a very real sense, the burden of proof is flipped, whereas the burden of proof in a trial would be on the state to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that somebody's guilty of an offense, or in a civil case it would be within the balance of probabilities. And this extradition treaty, the burden of proof is on the defense to show why one of the exceptions applies. And then that comes to the point you made about what the defense raised today, which is that they're arguing that the offenses as alleged are political offenses, and that is an exception under the treaty. The treaty does not permit extradition for political offenses. They also argue on top of that the very fact that they're asking extradition for political offenses is itself an abusive process. So it's a twofold argument. It's one, this is a political offense, so you cannot be extradited, or these offenses that are listed, because 18 charges in the indictment. So at the very least, because it's still preliminary stages, I didn't hear what their argument is on the computer misuse charge. That's one of them, conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. But on the other 17 offenses, those are all under the Espionage Act. So they're arguing that, okay, no, this is all political, and the very fact that you're arguing in favor of political charges shows that you're abusing, this is an abusive process. Now obviously the CPS, not the CPS, the prosecutor on behalf of the US government is essentially arguing no, that you can't make that argument, that arguing in favor of these offences is itself an abusive process. So that's up in the air, that's like a legal dispute. And then there's a whole other series of grounds as well that they're saying abusive process is being argued in multiple counts. That's just one of the counts.
Yeah,
and the defense was coming back and saying that the information that the prosecution is presenting is so grossly mischaracterized and so divorced from what they say the reality is, that the provenance of the charges is impossible, really, based on the facts. And also, I thought a great moment was when the Edward Fitzgerald, representing Assange, said he was taking the mickey out of the prosecution for citing a New York Times article from 2010 as evidence that sources were put at risk in the field in Afghanistan. So that was a big part of the prosecution's argument, was that what Manning and Assange did put lives at risk, put sources at risk, and agents in the field, informants, and things like that. And he cited the New York Times as evidence, and of course the defense dismantled that fairly handy.
Well, ironically, he dismantled it by citing the very same article. He said, but Mr. Lewis needed to continue reading what it is that the New York Times said in that piece, which was interesting, because I remember thinking, like, what, did they not see that coming? So in the piece, basically they said the New York Times is somewhat critical of WikiLeaks, and I think that people can remember this, for people who do remember back what was happening then, arguing that WikiLeaks was publishing material and not redacting names. And then the same article would go on to say, but WikiLeaks would end up doubling down with its redaction procedures and putting in more effort to ensure that information that might be too sensitive was redacted. Which is interesting, because that flies in the face of the very argument that the prosecution was arguing, which...
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think it was really interesting that the fact they brought up that the actual documents that were published were not actually, with the unredacted names, didn't come from WikiLeaks in the first place, which was important. I believe that was The Guardian that was responsible for that. They didn't mention that in the courtroom, but there was a little giggle in the press room when that happened. But and so, if the prosecution's argument is allowed to be pursued under that rationale, it should actually be The Guardian or whoever the editor at the time was. I'm not sure if it was Rusbridger or would have been at
Deepa,
that time.
I want to get your thoughts in about that fact, because I could see you nodding your head, and I know that it's often not discussed in the media that it was in fact the New York Times and The Guardian that also published this same information. And The Guardian, one of their authors or one of their journalists authored a book where he released a password, a sensitive password. Can you talk about that?
I'd actually like to go back a step and talk about the way the conversation has been defined. Yet again, the conversation has been defined by the state in a way in which due process is actually undermined using the law. And by saying that all they can talk about in this extradition hearing is X and Y, and not engaging with what's really at stake here, which is freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right for people to understand the evidence of governments committing crimes in their name, of governments being corrupt. And that's what Chelsea and Julian did. They allowed us to see the evidence, and that's something that is tremendously important because, as Patrick Colburn, as Vijay Prashad have said, these things were, people on the ground were well aware of these things, but there was no way to prove that these things happened. And that's what Julian and Chelsea did. And what WikiLeaks is it is a wonderful, wonderful innovation for whistleblowers to be able to give vast amounts of information very securely on a very large scale. And if we start talking simply about how the prosecution is mounting this case and purely in terms of the legalities in the way the prosecution wants to mount it in a distorted court proceedings about a man who has been psychologically tortured by 3 states who have colluded and who have removed his citizenship without due process. I just think this is an absurdity in itself. And of course, you know, these so-called journalists, how many of them have the same 100% accuracy track record that WikiLeaks does? And how many of them have cared? Because we've seen plenty of evidence that Julian was sitting through the night redacting names, whereas these journalists were very happy to publish information without redactions. So it's clearly about, this trial is clearly about setting an example and saying to journalists, if you ever open your mouth again about state secrets, about crimes that your governments commit, about corruption by big and powerful people, we will shut you down and we will hound you to your death. And if journalists cannot be bothered to report on that, I read an article, or maybe it was a comment from you, Tareq, on Twitter, which said the journalists' room had half emptied after the prosecution had put its case, and what was this idea? Was it an idea of balance? And clearly it's not. And I think it's very important as critical speakers that we redress that balance by talking about what the case should really be about and what kinds of questions we should ask. Because I think once you're sitting as a lawyer in this case, you've been in the system 10 years trying to prove something which you shouldn't have to fight anyway, it becomes very easy to buy into that discourse. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, and I mean, that's probably a good point to focus on. There was lots of points from the defence which really kind of took apart what a lot of that kind of narrative had been. I think the lawyer identified 12 different abuses of power, which I think we maybe get into. But I mean, what were your kind of thoughts about the different abuses of power in terms of which one was kind of the most powerful argument?
They did lay out quite an extensive laundry list on that, on the abusive process, and also on the how this is being framed politically, and this is why if it's that political, then of course it falls foul of the Anglo-American extradition treaty, and so that's a pretty extensive case that they laid out. I was surprised that Luke Harding wrote that book and divulged a sensitive password, and that caused a problem in terms of potential exposure. And WikiLeaks had made a decision, a prudent decision, to release everything in order to give people notice so that operatives could leave the field. That actually very much comes into play with the last part of this conversation you just had. So that could also be interjected in there. I'm getting off the subject a little bit. But in terms of abuse of power, yeah, it's kind of obvious that the ecosystem that this is taking place in is completely out of whack. Politically, geopolitically, that's pretty obvious. The problem is, you're in legal land, it has its own set of rules and protocols, and as much as it might be obvious outside the bubble, that there's a huge imbalance of power, and that there's a massive abuse of power by the United States and states colluding with it. That's not necessarily going to win in the arena, which is the courtroom. And that's a very frustrating thing. It comes down to minutia, minute points like dual criminality standards and things like that. And the British system is very different than the American system. So here the protocol is much more. there's a line of communication that needs to be maintained between the judge and the QCs, and then the lawyers. We have a totally slightly different system in America, how the courtroom plays out, and so they do have to be respectful and thorough in their arguments here. And British law does rely a lot on precedent, very much so. That also comes into play, and so on that point, I think the defense made a much stronger case by far. Although I didn't agree with it, it was very Trumpian.
Critical of Trump.
Yeah. And saying that this war on whistleblowers in America only came with Donald Trump being elected in office, and that's not actually true. It began long before that. But I see that's the defense wanting to make to highlight that as a political point, and so Trump's like the low-hanging fruit. But besides that, 90% of the rest of the case they made was excellent, and I think the judge took note and pushed back more against the prosecution than the defense in terms of the opening argument and wanting clarification on things. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question about the dual criminality, but just for maybe people that don't know about that, could you give it a little quick summary?
Sure. So one thing I realized that we didn't do, so just maybe to run through it very quickly, is that for people to actually understand what was actually argued by the state. So they did make the point. What they're arguing is, this is what they said. This is what James Lewis QC said on behalf of the U.S. government. We're not seeking extradition as sort of a revenge for proof, revealing war crimes. This has nothing to do with the collateral murder video, which we all know shows an American gunship massacring civilians. This is in Iraq, including 2 Reuters journalists and people who then come to try to help them as well, just bystanders. And this has nothing to do with revealing embarrassing information. This has everything to do with revealing the names and identities of sources in the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war logs, and the diplomatic cables which WikiLeaks recklessly or otherwise failed to redact. That was the very strong point that he made at the very beginning. Like, this is what it's about. This goes to the heart of the matter. And then he proceeded to refer to various exhibits, A1, A2, A3. This person was in Syria in a diplomatic cable. His identity, according to the document, should have remained secret, and it wasn't. So it sounded very strong. It always sounds strong when you just hear the prosecution side, and that's what the grand jury would have heard when they chose to indict, because the grand jury only ever hears, with very rare exceptions, and in this case was not an exception, only ever hears the prosecution side of events, and they decide based on the prosecution's best case whether to initiate an indictment. But then the defense comes along, and the defense also then comes around and starts rebutting many of these points. And then one of them is, of course, about dual criminality. And the dual criminality point is basically this. One of the exceptions, we already said, is under the law, under the treaty, is if the crime is a political crime, then you can't extradite, right? Another exception, well, another requirement, if you want to satisfy extradition, is that whatever is an alleged crime in the United States has to be a crime here as well. So I knew somebody, for example, who worked in the financial services regulator, and they said we often would get requests for extradition to the U.S., but we'd have to say to them, yeah, but what you're complaining about over there in terms of financial crimes isn't a crime over here. Now, I'm not saying whether that's a good or bad thing, like Britain is like the money laundering capital of the world, right? I'm just saying that's an issue. And when it comes to finance, right, they would raise that. So when it comes to like finance, so this is the financial regulator, by the way, saying this. This is not like a defense lawyer saying like, sorry, we can't help you out with this because what you're asking for or what you're alleging isn't an offense here. And that's because under the treaty, if what is alleged in the United States isn't an offense in England and Wales, then you shouldn't be extraditing. And so that was something that the prosecution sought to lay out. And actually one of the reasons is quite important, and this was raised in the press room, in the press annex where we were based, right? So for people who don't know, we weren't in the actual courtroom. We were in a separate room with a television screen where for the first hour we couldn't hear anything because no one was speaking into the mics. And then notes got passed to the judge, and that got sorted out a bit later. And on that point of dual criminality, you could hear the prosecutor saying he would quote the 1911 Official Secrets Act, not the 1984.
Yeah.
89 Official Secrets Act. I'm not 100% of the date, it's in the 80s. And the reason that's significant is because the 1911 Official Secrets Act is about prosecuting spies, it's about targeting spies. So he's trying to say, look, we've got the 1911 Official Secrets Act, which is like the same as, to prove dual criminality, which is like the same as the Espionage Act they've got in the States. And I suppose that shows a rather frightening position that the CPS made, not CPS, sorry, it is the prosecutor on behalf of the US government, what James Lewis QC made, which is that their argument is Julian Assange is not a journalist. He said that multiple times. Julian Assange is not a legitimate journalist. He's not a journalist. The legitimate outlets, The Guardian and The New York Times, they redacted sensitive information. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks published information wholesale they didn't redact, and therefore they put at risk the lives of sources in Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and elsewhere. Journalists, human rights activists, noble warriors for truth and justice who've been passing on information secretly to the United States government and whose names are now revealed, and that was their argument. The defense went and they countered that, actually. One interesting point is that, no, he did make it clear, there is no evidence that any harm had come. So he was only put at risk. Mm-hmm. And as the Don't Extradite Assange campaign noted in a statement after during the lunch break, you could argue that about any whistleblower, about any news article that is critical of government, that exposes waste, fraud, corruption, and criminality, that you put at risk someone somewhere, intelligent.
Likely harm. Likely harm.
Yeah, it's put at risk. So yeah.
And I think they did the kind of typical smearing thing of to say that because some of these WikiLeaks documents had been found in Osama bin Laden's cave or so, and I guess it's to kind of associate that name with Osama bin Laden, to think, because he had access to that means WikiLeaks is inherently an evil organization. But what if 10 minutes earlier Osama bin Laden had been reading the BBC? He has access to the internet, he could be viewing all sorts of things. Are we going to go prosecute everything that, every publication that someone reads?
Yeah.
I don't think, that's not a...
It was 3 emails. This is what they said. They said in Osama bin Laden's possession after he was assassinated, they found a trove of documents. And among that trove, we're not told, like you said, articles from the New York Times or The Guardian or anyone else, various other Al-Qaeda operatives had forwarded 3 emails containing disclosures from WikiLeaks. So is that but that's it. It wasn't information that was then used to carry out assassinations or terrorist acts. It was literally, that was just a side note that the prosecution said, I'll point out the fact that after he was assassinated, they didn't use the term assassinated, after the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound, I think was the language they used, they found that some people had emailed a couple of articles to Osama bin Laden referencing things from WikiLeaks. And then that was it.
I think this idea of putting people at risk is very interesting, because it's almost as if putting people at risk, people who are corrupt, people who are actually causing harm, people who are killing other people, is more dangerous than actually killing them. Because the number of people who've died, the thousands of people who've died in Iraq and Afghanistan, their lives don't count. The women and children who've been raped and murdered, their lives don't count. Oh yes, we're putting some informants potentially at risk, and no harm ever occurred, but we will extradite you to the United States for 175 years and lock you away somewhere where neither your lawyers nor you can talk to the public. And you will be tried without First Amendment protections in the US. And this is what is at the heart of this debate, this ability to spin the narrative, to make us concerned, to ascribe all these positive ideals, as Catherine Barron puts it, towards negative ends. So you talk about whether it is feminism and protection of women and, the safety of women, and all the Swedish allegations which come around those, rather than thinking about the women who were actually raped, murdered and tortured in Iraq and Afghanistan or elsewhere in the world. Oh yes, that's important. What about putting people at risk? Let's worry about who might have potentially been put at risk. Let's not worry about the risk that has already crystallized, really.
I think that's an excellent point of comparing the actual war crimes that WikiLeaks has revealed time and time again, and very recently with Syria and the Douma chemical weapons attack, alleged chemical weapons attack, we should say. Again, it's the service that they've provided has kind of revolutionised how journalism takes place now.
There's one point I wanted to actually get Mohammed's opinion on as a legal mind, or pro bono legal advisor. So I saw the prosecution. Most of what they're talking about was rehashing the Chelsea Manning trial from 10 years ago, really, and that a lot of that has already been, it's out in public. Discovery's been done. There's not a lot of new information there. But the argument the prosecution was making, which I think the defense seemed to let it slip, at least today, but that Assange was aiding and abetting Chelsea Manning, and so according to the dual criminality standard, the Espionage Act and the Official Secrets Act being kind of equivalent, but he was an accessory. He was aiding and abetting. He was an accomplice to Chelsea Manning, who actually did, who was bound by the American version of the Official Secrets Act, let's say. But so of course there's a case there, but Julian Assange, and this argument was made. I even think the judge pushed back slightly on this, that Assange is not a U.S. citizen.
The language of the government, and you can see this in all the headlines that have in the lead up to the Assange case. And this is particularly true right now because the mainstream media is not questioning why it is that someone who revealed war crimes is in prison, whereas the people who committed the war crimes are running free, putting up posters of themselves, going out to parties, doing things, having fun. So that's really important. The other important thing is whether, Julian Assange is in a very unique position. Of course, he's in a unique position because he's being tortured, and he's been tortured and slandered and maligned for several years. But think about how bad this is for Britain, that a treaty that's clearly not fit for purpose is being used to extradite so many people to very, very difficult situations abroad. And Assange's case, at least now, thanks to the activists, is being tried in a way in which there is some public discourse about it, despite there being a complete media blackout. We had this huge rally over the weekend, and you look at any of the mainstream media in the UK and how much they've written about it, it's been pretty negligible, really. And we've seen this in other discourses where people have said, we've had these huge rallies, nobody's picked it up. And it's important that we realise that journalism is not just repeating what the government says or talking about things in the language that the government allows. It is also about digging behind the facts. And part of that important thing about journalism is presenting the evidence and allowing people to make up their own mind. And this is about governments not disclosing things and people like WikiLeaks enabling transparency, just like people who show when there is, and WikiLeaks has done this too, has shown when people have hidden money in a tax haven. So when you disclose that information, it might be supposedly illegal in those states to breach that confidentiality. But what is more illegal is the kind of tax dodging or the kind of corruption or the kind of war crimes that are happening underneath, and that's what needs to be disclosed. And so let's think about what journalists, we don't do torture, so it must not be happening, rather than investigating what has happened. It's also very interesting how they haven't investigated when Professor Meltzer has provided clear information. They haven't investigated the interference that the Swedes prosecution had from the UK and the treatment of Julian, the conditions in which he was kept. They've disregarded British law in terms of his right to a fair trial, his right to freedom of speech. They've disregarded the sweeping, absolutely appalling extraterritorial reach of the US state, who was seeking to try in a person who does not have US citizenship for an activity that's not even a crime in the jurisdiction in which the activity was conducted. And all of this, in terms of the British state's involvement in the ongoing, long-term, severe psychological torture of a journalist. This is horrendous torture. Imagine having your name associated with a smear for such a long time. Imagine being cut off when the people who surrounded you, them being told you are this horrible, nasty person, being told that you hurt your cat. All these kinds of things are designed to break people down, and we don't know what the long-term physiological impact of such torture is, as the doctors very clearly, doctors' letters said 3 times now. These professionals have written to the government, and the government has not taken this seriously, and this is really, really important.
Yes, I absolutely agree, and you bring up some very important points. I think that the governments are perhaps unwilling to really address this torture, because then they would have to admit that they were actually subjecting somebody to torture. And we know, of course, that Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, met with Julian Assange on May 9th of 2019, issued a report a few weeks after, and they are legally obligated, the UK government is legally obligated to investigate this, and they have failed to do so. But you bring up a point about support for Julian Assange and sort of this disinformation campaign that has been very effective. Fortunately, I was there today. I was outside the courtroom, and I will tell you that there is a lot of support for Julian Assange, and people are very fired up about this case. The French Yellow Vests were there. Other Free Julian Assange supporters were there as well. People were singing. They were chanting. It was a peaceful demonstration. Of course, police were there, and there were some exchanges with police and protesters, as you would expect at any normal demonstration or event, but it never got violent. It was never really hostile. But it's important to also highlight the overwhelming amount of support that there is for him, and I know we'll be posting some footage that I was able to capture later this evening on our website, the Watchdog. And then before we do move on to some other topics, and specifically the support for Julian Assange, if you could talk about our new website. And I know you just recently published an article that you've been working on for some time now. So if you want to discuss that and let everybody know where they can follow us on Twitter, or the Watchdog on Twitter, and also where they can access the work.
Yeah, well, I guess we've talked a lot here and just in general about the failure of the mainstream media, and I'm very critical of the media, even though I was a part of it, but I was always kind of aware of the problems and the failures of it. So yeah, I had the opportunity when I left Newsweek to kind of think about what I wanted to do next. So I thought long and hard about ideas that I've been formulating for a while, and I decided to if I'm going to do it, this is going to be the time. So so the Watchdog going to be an independent news wire service, I believe. I'm kind of still work in progress at the moment. I have to get some good reporters on my on my team, if I can outpay Sputnik. But I need some more Bitcoin donations, I think. But I'm kind of trying to have a news service that's going to be beneficial to alternative media, kind of helping them. Even though their levels of reporting have probably been much better than the mainstream media on many issues, but kind of from my perspective, there's definitely lots of improvement in the way that their articles are structured, or fact checking, or kind of just basic things that asking for comment, which sometimes you don't really see on alternative media, and that's probably because they know they'll never really get a response. But just doing kind of solid journalism and kind of taking it back to what journalism should be, which kind of hasn't been in a while. So that's my hope, and hopefully it's going to be kind of that's why it's a wire service. I want it to be something that's beneficial to all alternative media, and if mainstream media want to use the services that we provide, they're more than welcome to. I also want to set up the structure of the whole organization, that it stays independent over time, which I think is the biggest challenge for independent media, for people not becoming corrupted. The website is thewatchdog.net. Just published an article today, kind of the summary of today's proceedings in court. So the headline, I believe, was that Trump extorted Julian Assange. something along those lines. That's what the lawyers have said today, and that was one of the kind of main arguments made today by the defence, which I guess we can get into a little bit.
Before we do that, though, I do want to ask everybody right now who is watching to please retweet us. You can follow us at WD Newswire, correct? Yes, so follow us on Twitter at WD Newswire. Catch us on YouTube as well. Make sure you subscribe, and then comment about this new podcast that we're doing this week. Leave us your thoughts, your comments, maybe some topics that you would like us to discuss surrounding the full extradition hearing, of course, and Julian Assange and issues related to free speech and a free press. We really appreciate that. And again, just to give you guys a reminder, we will be hosting this podcast every day this week after the court proceedings. But yeah, we should definitely move on to Trump's role in all of this and how he was brought up as well.
Could I just make another point about just about the people outside? And it's quite interesting that there was a range of people outside. I saw a little baby, and I also bumped into Eric, who's in his 90s, and it was the same last week, which was quite interesting because we had the wonderful, inspirational woman leader, Selma James. She led our delegation. We went as an all-women delegation to deliver the international jurist letter to Boris Johnson over the weekend, and it was just wonderful to see. And I can admit that I've met some amazing people along the way as a result of being part of this campaign, people who share my values, and that's been quite liberating in some ways to see other people who are willing, just like yourselves, to challenge the mainstream narrative. So.
Yeah, and
good luck with your new campaign.
Thank you. And just from my perspective, I think the work that the activists have done has been absolutely incredible. And I was it was very heartwarming to see the kind of community that's there with, even for Action for Assange, that you guys are formed a very nice community of people that will help each other
I should probably mention that too. So obviously I am from the US and am one of the co-founders of Action for Assange. Right now, as we speak, they are holding a series of demonstrations and protests in Washington, D.C. So if you are in that area, make sure that you join them. They've worked really, really hard to set this up. These demonstrations and protests are sponsored by Code Pink, Popular Resistance, Veterans for Peace, among several other organizations. So if you can, do check out what they're doing. I believe they're going to be live streaming on Twitter throughout the day, but of course they're back in the States, and right now it's about early afternoon there, I believe.
4 o'clock.
Yeah, okay, it's 4 o'clock out there, so they're probably going to be wrapping up some of their events, but they will be doing this every day this week to show support for Julian Assange back in the States.
I believe there are actions taking place all over the world, in particular in Sydney, in Edinburgh, in London. So there's an event taking place on Tuesday, that's tomorrow, in central London. So I'd urge people to get involved in the discussion, because if we want to reclaim the narrative, if we want to take to have freedom ourselves, we have to put in whatever it takes to reclaim that freedom. If we can't do it sitting on the sidelines and hoping that the system takes care of itself, because the system is completely broken and it's being misused by those who are misusing their power, and then casting this narrative of WikiLeaks misusing power, which just seems bizarre to me.
Mm-hmm. I think that's important to note, that there might be a lot of people that don't know who Julian Assange is, which I was kind of shocked to discover when I was walking around or going to certain pubs in London. I was kind of just talking about what was going on in my life, talking about Julian Assange, and some people hadn't even heard of him. And I think it's important to stress actually just how important this legal case is. I think it's definitely one of the most important legal cases, not even just press freedom, but just overall whistleblower, everything. I think and if Assange is extradited and prosecuted in the United States, I think it's kind of the final nail of the coffin in the coffin for.
Yeah, and it basically means that, say, we always cast Russia or North Korea as the bad guys. Tomorrow, if we were to reveal corruption or state crimes there, it would mean that our journalists it sets the precedent for them to be extradited, for these countries to be able to demand, if they're in a position of power, for our journalists to be extradited. And it affects every single every single person, because if we find crime in the NHS, if we find corruption in the NHS, if we find corruption in our schools, we want to be able to disclose them. And if we do not support the kind of media that allows us to disclose those crimes, then and whistleblowers get taken down, then people will be afraid. And that's what the government's trying to do. That's what America is trying to do. They're trying to make people afraid of pointing out the crimes they're committing.
Julian Assange's U.S. attorney, Barry Pollock, said that this case, if Julian Assange is extradited to the U.S., tried and convicted, it will not only just impact journalists, it will impact everybody for the very reasons that you brought up, because this is basically an assault on the people's right to know and to have information, and they're trying to hinder that. So if you're somebody that's watching that thinks, well, this really doesn't impact my life, I'm not a journalist, I'm not an activist, I'm not an advocate for, or an outspoken advocate for free speech and free press and issues related to the First Amendment, you may think this doesn't impact you, but it certainly does. It certainly does. This is something that will have a significant impact on our world, how we talk about things, what we're allowed to disclose. So it's important to always keep that in mind. And then to go back to the support that was there today, I was not at the previous hearings, but from what I'm hearing is that this particular protest and demonstration has been the biggest yet. And in fact, you guys in the courtroom were able to hear the protesters. Can you guys talk about that?
To a degree that I wish we couldn't hear, quite frankly, because it was easier to hear the people shouting "Don't extradite Assange, free Julian Assange" outside of the press annex than it was to actually hear the prosecution or the judge speaking. So yeah, and even Kristen Harafson, the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, pointed out afterwards when we were speaking about it, he said they went on for 6 hours. Like, how can this guy not lose his voice after 6 hours of doing it? So yeah, he was quite impressed.
I think it's also worth people noting is that actually at one point in the hearing, sort of Julian waved over to the judge and said, I'm actually having a hard time hearing, and I'm very thankful to the supporters, but I just can't concentrate on what's going on.
Yeah, but I think that was also partially because of the lack of mic, because the judge kept telling after Assange said that, the judge started to direct both the prosecution and the defense to speak to the mic. And that's because we actually had to set up like a petition to the judge to say we can't hear anything. And the representative for the National Union of Journalists ended up passing on a message. We had to do a lot of that. So a message was taken to the court officer and to the security guy, and it was sent up to the judge as well. And then during lunchtime, they practice actually speaking into, because literally, if they're not speaking directly into the microphone, whether it's the judge or any of the legal representatives, we're in the press annex. We can't hear anything.
I think the other thing that we have to think about here is this is supposed to be one of the most important trials of this century, right? Why is it that there are only a small number of seats for the public when we know the press has been so bad at reporting about this case? Essentially, they're trying to cut down accountability. They're trying to close the discussion to ordinary people, and ordinary people are not stupid. While the press and all these clever, intelligent people have gone along with these fake Swedish allegations, they've gone along with saying that he's done this and he's done that, the people who really recognise what's going on the ground feel a deep connection to what Julian and Chelsea have done, and feel a deep gratitude. If what had been done was the gate had been shut outside to prevent us from going into the courtyard. And if this is really public property, and these public properties are there to serve us in providing justice, then why is the public being excluded from this discussion? Who are these journalists who deserve so much extra privacy that they get a press annex, whereas the public shut out and given even fewer seats than it had at Westminster Magistrates Court? And I think that's a question that needs to be asked, especially at a time when we are aware that there have been 3 recent disclosures of conflicts of interests of the judges who are overseeing the case. And these are things where the judiciary needs to be held to account. Politicians need to be held to account, and the judiciary needs to be held to account. And, the fourth estate, or whatever you call it, well, the third estate, I don't know what you call it, but they're not holding them to account. I don't see The Guardian and the BBC saying, here's Mark Curtis's article proving all these conflicts of interest. What are you doing, XYZ Justice Department or Justice Minister? Why isn't that discussion even taking place?
I guess that's why the Watchdog now exists.
But can I just say something on your point about people? I do find that as well. I think it's easy when you're with certain, when you spend time with like-minded people, as millions of people around the world inevitably do, it's easy to forget that, different people perceive, like they read different newspapers, they hear different information sources. And so whenever I happen to discuss with someone says, oh, well, what case are you covering or what have you, a random person that I happen to meet, and I mention the Assange thing, there's always, I actually had somebody in a car once when we were outside Belmarsh, and they slowed down in his car, and he's like, are they keeping Assange in Belmarsh? It's amazing the number of people who still don't even know that Julian Assange is being kept in Belmarsh. We have to say, that's why all these people are demonstrating. And they just don't know. So
and that's the failure of the media. That's the failure of the mainstream media to even acknowledge that somebody who's revealed war crimes is stuck in a prison while the people committing the war crimes are sitting outside.
Yeah, and I ran into somebody last night, so I was taking pictures of the people who are camped outside of Belmarsh prison, which is right next to Woolwich Crown Court as well, where Belmarsh Magistrates Court sits. And I went and I saw the various people who were camped out in the tents overnight so that they could queue up as well. And there was a group of people, young people, I'd never seen them before. They came in and they started sticking these stickers that said, like, wake the fuck up, like, notice what's happening with Julian Assange. And they stuck the sticker onto some of these random signs out in the street, and then they walked off. I went in there, I was taking a picture, and somebody else came along and said, who is that? So is that guy who was connected to WikiLeaks? So I explained very quickly. I said, yes, he's published classified U.S. documents which revealed, war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're accusing him of espionage. And this person said to me, it's like, well, I'm ex-forces, right? I used to be in the Queen's Guard. It's like, the reality is, like, the press don't really tell you what it is that's happening in those. And quite frankly, it's like someone needs to say what's happened.
And right? I think credit is due to people like Patrick Coburn, some people who have started to help change the discourse, because the discourse is changing. And this is my message to activists and supporters. The 10 years that many of these people have spent, the 10 years or more, supporting Julian, standing outside the Ecuadorian embassy in the cold and the rain, people like Clara, Emmy, all these people who have been doing a huge amount of work on the ground, who've been supporting him when everybody else was running away, their work is now starting to come to fruition. And if we can get the crimes of, the way in which the system has been criminally subverted in order to persecute and torture a journalist and publisher, if we can get that into the open, and if you can get to talk to more people explaining what's happening in your schools, in your trade unions, in your local Labour Party, there is a model motion for your CLP, please use those motions to get people at least talking about this. Because so-called socialists, so-called people on the left are not aware of this case, or because they're so put off by the smears, they're not willing to open their eyes to what's really going on. Because it's quite a hard thing to acknowledge that your government is trying to subvert the law and you have nowhere to go.
And also, you don't need to be a socialist to be opposed to the criminal prosecution of a journalist and publisher. Here's a quote I got finally from the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York.
Breaking.
I had notified them, just so people who might not be aware, it was revealed on the 23rd of January that the US government would be arguing in its legal submissions that the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which guarantees the right to freedom of speech and freedom of press, does not apply to foreign citizens. Now, that's their argument. If there's a trial in the United States, they'd still have to get that past a judge, a US judge. But the point is, that's what they were arguing, and that's what they're arguing in court during the extradition hearings. And there were also, we also know that so-called special administrative measures, or SAMs, will be applied to Julian Assange were he to be extradited. And what SAMs have varying degrees of severity, but one of the things, and they're most extreme, they can keep you, in a sense, in a federal prison without being able to speak to press, without being able to speak to family members, and anybody who's authorized by the state to speak to you, because you have to get permission. So even your lawyers have to be authorized by the government. They're not then permitted to speak to anybody else, and it can be quite a suffocating process. So I asked them what response they had to those 2 points. I will just read the response on the First Amendment issue, because that's quite interesting. This is what they said. This is from Bahar Azmi, who's the legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, that's based in New York. The First Amendment is designed to protect speech and restrict government abuse of power, namely restricting speech or punishing speech the government disagrees with or otherwise thinks is subversive. It cannot matter if the speech is made by a non-citizen or someone operating abroad. The apparatus of state punishment in the United States cannot silence protected speech, end quote. So it's just something to think about. And actually, if you want, I can read just their point on the SAMs. As we detail in our report, that's worth reading, a 2017 report on the Center for Constitutional Rights website. SAMs are abusive measures placing people in the darkest corner of the US, already punishing prison system. When used pre-trial, they are particularly abusive and coercive, as the government often leverages the harsh prison conditions to pressure a defendant into a plea bargain. They continue, they say, the conditions may vary on a case-by-case basis, but the fundamental essence, destroying an individual's ability to communicate to the outside world, including his ability to communicate about the harshness of the SAMs themselves. That's one of the conditions that you often get, right? Mm-hmm. That you can't speak to people about the conditions that is preventing you from speaking to people about.
Can I just make a point there, if I may, about this, please remember that right now, while Julian is in Belmarsh, he's not having access in the way he needs to prepare for his defence. So essentially, not only have they breached attorney-client privilege before he got into Belmarsh
in
prison,
the Ecuadorian embassy.
In the Ecuadorian embassy. While he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, we heard at the January hearing that, the February hearing, that for the past 2 months they had had 2 visits. Mm. So it is a situation where, in a minor way, it's already taking place. And while they may say this is all about, the defence proving that they cannot be extradited and so on, about exceptions, what we have to remember is that he's being condemned to potentially 175 years in a US prison. And, we think of people at Guantanamo, we think about, this is an effective life sentence. And we need to take a very strong stance on that. And I think a lot of things that happen in the courtroom depend upon what we outside are saying, whether it is the media, whether it is the public, whether it is political protest. And people have to join and come together to protest, because otherwise it will be too late.
As far as what you were discussing with the how the court proceedings would take place and what that would look like in the U.S., ex-CIA torture whistleblower John Kiriakou was tried and convicted in the same court where Julian Assange would be tried. This is the U.S. District Court of Virginia. It's known as the Espionage Court. Basically, all of the jury would be made up of intelligence or former intelligence or somebody who has a close relationship to intelligence officers. And also the jury would not be able to hear a majority of the information presented in the case. And you're right in saying that his attorneys would not really be granted the typical rights that they have to access certain information or speak to the public about this. We would not know much of what's taking place in this court. Many people make the false argument thinking that if Julian Assange is extradited to the U.S., that all of these revelations will come to light and that we will learn even more truths about our corrupt governments. That is unfortunately not at all the case. That is a myth. His case is a national security case, so he would be subjected to CIPA. The exact wording for what that acronym stands for, I'm not sure. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit, and the national security state that we're existing in the United States and in basically all of the Five Eyes countries.
Even in Britain, where you have this journalist being, and this important case being tried, but firstly, there's not coverage of it. Secondly, the public are not allowed to even listen. Mm-hmm. So it's already happening without even the SAMs being in place.
and they will use code words in the courtroom. They will use code words to reference something else that they're concerned that the public may find out about. It's a very secretive process, and I believe that there is a 100% conviction rate for anybody who is tried in that court in a national security related case or an espionage related case.
Can I just ask, is this very similar to what happens at Guantanamo in terms of the process? Because when, the Guantanamo hearings about the way in which Mitchell and Jessen have tortured people has started to drip feed some information, but we can see the use of the code words, we can see the inability of the inmates to communicate what they have to say, inability of their lawyers to speak outside. Is that quite similar to what will happen under the SAMs?
The fact that I'm not a legal expert, I don't want to weigh in on that. No, but I think that what you're saying, it's highly likely that it's very similar, but I don't want to speak too much to that because I don't have the legal expertise there. Maybe you do, Mohammed. We've been leaning on you for expert legal opinion tonight.
I should point out, I do not practice national security law, so I was briefly in the legal world before I transitioned to journalism, but this just so happens to be in my field of interest. So SIPA is the Classified Information Procedures Act, which is used in national security cases to restrict what types of things can be said, say in open court, as you said as well. So it's, I would say Guantanamo Bay is like on another level. For example, people are detained, one person was detained for 14 years until he was recently released. He was never charged with anything, right? So that completely violates like basic habeas corpus rights. Even in the most like abusive situation in the United States. I'm not saying something like that has never happened in the US, but that's quite rare where people are kept in that type of limbo. I think the harshness of the conditions. I did watch a video once by somebody from the ACLU that did try to point out that says actually the harshness of the conditions that some people face, or many people face in maximum security prisons in the United States is not too dissimilar from what people experience in Guantanamo. They weren't trying to downplay what people in Guantanamo were facing. They were trying to open people's eyes to the tragic reality that many countries, including America's prison system, was quite, barbaric, and it's not just the United States, obviously. So also in Guantanamo Bay, you don't necessarily have the right to fully see the charges against you or where the allegations come from, and that's normally not the case in the United States. Normally you will have it will vary, as the statement I read out points out, in terms of the severity. We don't know how strong or how severe the SAMs would be. But the very fact that that's an option and that there's no realistic prospect of how you would get the SAMs lifted. And in fact, SIPA is something on top of that. So it's we don't want to say it's exactly like Guantanamo because that is its own world, but it's bad enough, I think, is what you'd say.
And that was actually raised today by the legal defence to say there was four exceptions to or four protections against extradition, and one of the points raised that if Julian Assange was extradited, the prison conditions that he would be inhumane, and another point that was actually raised, which I don't think has been picked up too much by any of the media, is that the lawyers raised that they consider Julian Assange a high risk of suicide if he's extradited, and they say that his mental health is not very good. And there was some other sort of kind of points that they raised that why extradition should not be raised. So
political motivation of the U.S. directed against him due to the political opinions he holds. It should be barred because there's a real risk of discrimination on the basis of his foreign nationality. A third reason was because it involves the case involves a flagrant denial of the right to a fair trial under Article 6 of the European Convention of Human Rights, as well as the UK Human Rights Act, which implements it. And there was all kinds of reasons for that, including the fact that we know that UC Global was spying on privileged communications, including at the direction of the behest of US intelligence. and other violations of rights, like we said, degrading treatment, wholly disproportionate sentencing amounting to a life sentence, virtual certainty of inhuman and degrading treatment, and a question of, there's expert testimony as to whether or not he's at real risk, whether or not he'll receive that sentence. And then yes, unjust and oppressive by reason of mental condition and high risk of suicide, and unjust and oppressive by reason of lapse of time of the alleged offence. We didn't mention the fact that they pointed out, they said, look, these alleged offences happened in 2010, 2011. The Obama administration, the Justice Department, looked at this, and in 2013, they concluded that you couldn't go after WikiLeaks without opening the door to going after The Guardian or The New York Times. And so they noted that as much as the Obama administration wanted to go after Assange and WikiLeaks, that their legal department found that it would be unconstitutional and it would create too grave a threat, right? And so they're saying that the fact that it's been reopened by, if you like, by Trump administration, that shows abuse of process and political bias as well. So that was a factor. That's one of the reasons that they link into that.
I think it's important that we do talk about also the alleged pardon, because there was a lot of confusion about this last week, just a few days ago, and I know that it was brought up in court, so you guys have some additional information on that. But before we do touch on that, I want to once again remind everybody to please retweet us if you are enjoying watching this, share it on your social media, and remember that we will be hosting this podcast every day this week with a wide variety of guests, of course, that have extensive knowledge on this case and are advocates for Julian Assange and issues related to free speech and a free press. But why don't you guys weigh in on this alleged pardon and talk about maybe what was presented in court today?
Mm-hmm. So it was relating to a meeting from Congressman Dana
Rohrabacher.
Thank you, I was not going to pronounce that correctly. So he went to visit Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2017, I believe in September. And what was initially reported on Wednesday, and I guess you probably correct me a little bit here, but what was reported on Wednesday was that he went on the instructions of Donald Trump, and I guess that's what was reported by most people. Dana Rohrabacher kind of scaled that back a little bit to say that he went with the permission of Donald. It wasn't like he wasn't sent on instructions.
Yeah, he said I went on my own volition, that Trump had nothing to do with it, and that I was planning on suggesting that if Assange could provide evidence of the evidence that Russia was not involved in the DNC leaks, I would then present that to Trump to secure a pardon and suggest that he should be pardoned. Now, the way the press represented, like we said, when Fitzgerald QC made those comments in court at that last hearing, not this week, but previous week, he had, within a very brief moment, about 10 seconds, if even 10 seconds, was just generalized summarizing a witness statement, what was in the witness statement. And so if you understand how these things happen, and you've been to many court proceedings, you can understand that he wasn't testifying, and so he might have slightly mischaracterized, not deliberately, just, accidentally, what was said explicitly in the statement. And I think that is now what we understand to be the case. So it appeared that he'd said that, well, the witness statement will discuss that Rohrabacher was acting on the instructions of the president to offer a pardon if Julian Assange played ball and said the Russians had nothing to do with the DNC leaks. Right? That was basically the quote, thereabouts. And the press ran with headlines like, Trump offered pardon to Assange if he helped cover up Russia's involvement in hacks, right? That was like one, and similar headlines, that wasn't even what he said. Today it was made clear that in the witness statement, what they're alleging is that during this meeting, Rohrabacher said that he was there on the permission or with the knowledge and consent of the president, not on his instructions, but that he was there with his knowledge, and that he was there to encourage Assange to somehow prove that Russia wasn't involved in the DNC leaks, because he'd already said very clearly that Russia wasn't involved.
Well, I think it's actually a little bit, it's better to be a bit more specific, because it doesn't say that Russia wasn't the source of the leaks. What they were asking for is can you confirm who the source was? And I guess that links to the conversation about Seth Rich, who was the DNC staffer that was murdered in Washington DC, who many people suspect of being the WikiLeaks source for the DNC leaks. And then I published on the Watchdog last week that I've had multiple people from close associates to Julian Assange to confirm that he was the source.
Assange would never himself
reveal a source.
reveal the source, which is ultimately the conclusion of that meeting, right? That and this is a point that Craig Murray made to me as well, which is you can't prove a negative, in this case help Trump out, as it were, with his issues by proving Russia wasn't the direct source, because without revealing the identity of the source, right? So it's so ultimately it takes, I think, the wind out of the sails of the way the mainstream press were peddling the story, which was there's a conspiracy to cover up Russian interference and Russian hacking, which is, to be fair, if you read the headlines, that's what it looked like. But the only reason that they're arguing it, they're putting this forward, is they're saying, look, this is proof of political bias. Because this is... If the case is a pure criminal justice case about 2010-2011 release of classified documents, then why should you get a pardon if you can prove, even if you can prove, that the 2016 DNC leaks came from someone else, say like Seth Rich or whoever, right? The two shouldn't be connected, and the fact that that was even on the table, even as a possibility, shows that there is a political abuse there's a political case and that there's abuse of process. That's the reason they're putting that in.
And it's also important to note that there was this pardon offer made and then the indictment followed.
Exactly.
So they were willing to cooperate with Julian Assange if he'd given them information. When he said, I'm not revealing who my source is, then the indictment came. So it shows that, there was no change in any of the information from 2010. All the information was known then, so the decision to bring the prosecution at that time is very revealing of the sort of motivations of the indictments.
One thing I'd also like to say is, this is completely unrelated to the Trump issue, but if you think about what a journalist really should do and look about protection of sources, this shows the principles behind how Julian Assange envisages WikiLeaks. It also shows up some of these journalists who I think might have cracked a lot sooner had they been put in a maximum security prison and smeared for 10 years. So, not casting aspersions on anybody's character, but this shows the kind of person we're working to protect. And the kind of person who deserves our protection, given how many people whose lives he's saved. Because really, it's his work and Chelsea Manning's work and the other, Catherine Garn and others, whose work has helped put an end to wars like Iraq.
Yeah, exactly. And also, too, Julian Assange and other staff members at WikiLeaks have helped other whistleblowers and have worked to help them with their legal funds in particular. In fact, it was Sarah Harrison who helped Edward Snowden seek asylum in Russia or make it to Russia. And they've also helped Chelsea Manning, and source protection is something that's very important to the organization, and it's something that Assange takes very seriously. And you're right in saying that this is something that we haven't ever seen before from a media entity. And also, to be clear, this is just an interesting fact if you guys don't already know, that are watching, but WikiLeaks has a 100% accuracy rate in reporting. That is unheard of. That is absolutely unheard of. So whenever you're hearing or seeing in the media, in the corporate media, that Julian Assange isn't a journalist or that WikiLeaks really isn't a media organization, think about that and think about that 100% accuracy rate and also how many awards have been won.
And think about the spinelessness of people like Luke Harding and others who have managed to, take all this information, these organizations across the world that have taken his information, published it, and don't care that their source is now in trouble. In fact, there is evidence to prove that they were trying to get WikiLeaks to publish stuff first, so that WikiLeaks could take the blame. And then they wanted to scoop them and all this kind of machinations in the background. And look at their journalistic ethics, and look at the journalistic ethics of the person who's currently in Belmarsh. And that's worth contrasting, really.
It kind of links back to the point you were making about Centre for Constitutional was it
Rights.
rights of the person, the head of that organisation was one of Julian's best friends, Michael Ratner, and
his lawyer, his US lawyer, and his
so I guess it speaks to why Julian has such high level of morals about protection of journalists and whistleblowers and those kind of people. Is that actually those people that have been doing that kind of work in his direct experience, they've either suffered tragic accidents where people have died or things of that nature, and so he understands that actually there is a very real risk of these types of people dying, and that's why we need to protect sources.
Yeah. And this is not about whitewashing Julian Assange or things like that. This is about saying he's been smeared so badly, let's look at the realities here and not look at the smears, let's look at what he's really like. So I think
there were many people who spoke about, or not many, but there were several people who have spoken about his character, people who know him personally and call him a friend. And this was specifically at the Courage Foundation series of events that they held throughout the United States, where they had panelists, journalists, and legal experts basically get together in various cities across the country and talk about this prosecution of Julian Assange. And his attorney, Renata Avila, said that she was not only his legal advisor and his attorney, but she was also a friend of his, and she said that he is a person of high moral character, and this is someone that is a good man who, despite the media saying that he is bad with women, he's surrounded by a lot of women that he has great relationships with, and she just spoke about his character and that he is someone of very high moral integrity. So I encourage everyone who is watching right now, if you have not seen the Courage Foundation events or weren't able to attend one if you're not in the U.S., do check them out, because I learned a lot and I've been invested in this case quite a bit within the past year, and I was able to learn so much information, and I was exposed to a lot of things that you typically aren't exposed to, and hearing from people that know him very well was really, really important. It put a very human side to this case.
And it's very important for us to also correct the record, which I know a lot of activists have been trying to do when people say, oh, the Swedish charges, there were never any charges. So things like that, when people just use lay conversation, which then overlays all kinds of negative connotations over this discourse, we really need to correct that, because that will help to have a more reasonable discourse about what it is that is actually going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there for this evening, so thanks for the guests for joining us tonight, and we'll continue this tomorrow, same time at 7 p.m. UK time, which will be 2 p.m. in the United States.
7 p.m, not 7:30.
It'll be sometime in the evening, and guys, we will tweet it out when we will go live. Maybe a couple moments prior, we will tweet it out, or maybe an hour before, so you guys are informed of when we will go live. Of course, we are working with several people in this, and our guests have their own schedules and their own work that they're doing, so the times are going to vary a little bit, but you can expect us to be doing this podcast every day this week to talk about Julian Assange's full extradition hearing. Again, it will be myself, Taylor Hudak, and Tareq Haddad that are hosting this podcast, and it will be held in the evening around 7:30 GMT time. So thank you guys all for watching us. Make sure you do subscribe and that you do follow us on Twitter at WD Newswire, and then also go to our website, thewatchdog.net. We will be reporting all about this full extradition hearing, and make sure you do check out Tareq's most recent article that he just published today, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.